Good evening, everyone, and welcome. For those who are visiting, my name is Father Daniel Scheid. I'm the pastor of St. Vincent's. And when it came time to discern a speaker for our parish mission, I got to know Dr. Sue Baars from work that she's done in a program helping pastors receive and mentor and provide adequate support for newly ordained clergy. Bishop Rhodes has sent a number of us priests, Father Terry Coonan, Father Jonathan Norton, Monsignor Shoemaker, Father Andrew Budzinski, to learn from people like Dr. Baars. And I was so impressed with her presentations that I invited her and she graciously accepted to come. She's a licensed professional counselor and marriage and family therapist. She lives in Irving, Texas, and has flown to our glacier-flattened state on this gorgeous pre-spring evening. She's in private practice with a number of other therapists. She's worked extensively in the field of counseling since 1986 in both hospital and outpatient settings, and she focuses her work on the integration of the Christian anthropology, the view of the human person of St. Thomas Aquinas, with the treatment of a variety of emotional and spiritual problems, among them emotional deprivation disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, and scrupulosity. She's a popular presenter at Catholic conferences around the country. She's been a frequent guest on EWTN's Women of Grace, and she often presents the work of her late father, psychiatrist and author Conrad Baars, and Sue will be speaking about her father this evening. He was a pioneer in the field of Catholic psychology. Sue was on the faculty of the Institute for Priestly Formation, where I taught for many years, where she taught diocesan seminarians, and she's past president of the Catholic Psychotherapy Association and holds a doctorate in family therapy from Texas Women's University. And I'm so grateful that you're here, Sue, because often I speak for all the priests of St. Vincent's in our own lives and in those we serve. Oftentimes in the confessional, what comes out as the capital sin of anger or struggling to forgive, the spiritual dimension of that has deeply human roots. And I'm just so grateful that people like yourself are so dedicated to the integration of body, mind, and spirit so that we can exist for the praise of his glory. So, welcome.
Thank you so much, Father Dan. You can hear me okay? Wow, I got here about 20 minutes ago and there were like 5 people, and it's just so wonderful to see. It's almost full here. This is great. I think I'm going to put this down for the moment. Well, it's been a privilege to do all those things as Father Dan was talking about them, and I really feel like the Lord drew me into this field of psychology because of my father's work. And I wanted to give you a little bit of like an overview of what I'm going to be talking about for tonight and the next 2 nights. And it was sort of interesting, I have to say, that first, I think, Father Dan, you invited me to come, and then I said yes. And then I think a few months later, we were talking about, well, maybe you can give another couple talks while you're here. And then I think maybe I just misunderstood. It was like, oh, and you're giving the parish mission for Lent. I'm like, oh, okay. So here I am. So tonight, I wanted to give you, I don't always talk about this. It's just because people don't know about it. And we actually are republishing this book by a new publisher. So I don't have very many copies of this book. So if you want to find out more where you can get it afterwards, if you're interested, you can ask me, or you can look at our website, which is baarsinstitute.com. But I wanted to, I hope what I can convey to you tonight is not only how my father was, from being a medical student in Amsterdam in the early 40s, and how he ended up in a concentration camp for a year and a half and how he survived. But I also want to convey to you how that affected him as a young man and affected his faith and how the effect it had on his whole life. And then the other talks that I'm going to be giving, the one tomorrow is, I think you probably know it was on your website, but it's called Affirming Presence, Strengthening the Family. So I'll talk about what affirmation is and what it is not, because that's a real common term. And then I'm going to talk about how I see it can help families to be strengthened and some of how we can do that. As we were coming from the airport, Michael Dodd was talking about Fort Wayne. I've never been here before. I had the privilege of being in Indianapolis a couple years ago at the Eucharistic Congress. So I've been to your state before, but he was just telling me about Fort Wayne. And it sounds like it's such a wonderful place to live and to raise children. And so I think some of the things that I'll be talking about, a lot of you will resonate with, I hope. And if it's new information, that'll be all to the good, that I can maybe help deepen some of the things that you've done with your kids or you want to do with your children. And then the last talk I'm going to give on Tuesday evening is entitled Anger and Forgiveness. And so there I'm going to talk briefly about anger and what it is as an emotion, because as Father Dan just said, a lot of times people here, they know enough, they've been educated enough, so they know about the 7 capital sins, and anger is one of them, but they haven't really had much teaching about the fact that the Lord created us to have that as one of the emotions, and that St. Thomas Aquinas talks about those emotions as all good and helpful, and we call them, as coming into the 21st century, we call them more like anger and hope and even despair as an emotion, not as a sin, and love, desire, and joy, and some of the others. St. Thomas calls them, and we call them, psychological motors. They're just motors to help us to live, and they're all directed, really, they should be, under the guidance of our reason. So we have to understand them. And once we understand them, then we can begin to look at, like, well, what in terms of what I've been doing or thinking is, constitutes a real sin, and what is just getting angry in response to something that is not helpful, or it's an injustice. So how does it help me, and how do I have to direct it? And then I'm going to be talking about what forgiveness is and what forgiveness is not. Because that also, I think, as I grew into this profession, I began to look at, a lot of times people will come in, we have a mainly Catholic practice where I am, and we want to, even people that are lifelong Catholics will come in, they don't necessarily want to talk about Catholicism, they don't need it to be discussed in the session, but they want their faith to be supported. And so what I found a lot of times is people don't even really have an idea of what it means to forgive. And I thought, many years ago, I worked with someone, and he helped sort of define what is a way to actually forgive? What does it mean to forgive? And I'll share that with you. So what I want to do here, this is I should mention too that my father, when he came to the United States in 1946, he actually, he hadn't met my mother yet. We hadn't been born. There's 3 of us. He wrote this story, and he actually, the original title of this, what we call the Doctor of the Heart, he wrote it, the original title was Communism in Nazi Buchenwald. And so he was talking, he wanted actually his future children, and now I'm passing this on to you and other people, he wanted people to know what this ideology did and how they were and what they needed to fight against, and really I see it as also what do we need to fight against as well. So my father, Conrad Baars, he grew up in the Netherlands. He was from Rotterdam, which is I think the 2nd largest city in the country. Let me just see, I don't know about you all, but holding a bottle of water, reading this, and then pressing buttons and keeping an eye on the time is like, I'm not good at multitasking. So if you see me like, just pausing, just give me some grace here. So here he is. I will say this too, because I'll talk more about this, a little bit more about it tomorrow. But my father, later on in his life, as I mentioned just a minute ago, he he met a woman through God's providence who was also a psychiatrist, a Catholic psychiatrist, who had based all her work on the psychology of St. Thomas Aquinas. And the two of them together wrote books, which are on our website, where we continue to update them and publish them. And really, they were pioneers in the field of integration of modern psychology with Thomistic psychology, the psychology of St. Thomas. And you might be thinking, well, what does that mean? And we can, certainly talk about that this week. But they were, I'll just mention this too, in 1971, they were well known, and they were invited to the Vatican Synod of Bishops. So all the bishops of the world were supposed to be there. And they had worked, my father met this woman, Dr. Anna Tarua, in the late 50s, and worked with her, was sort of a student of hers, then they became colleagues, and then they began to write books. And so they were very well known. And so they were invited to give this talk, and they talked about, at that time, and get this is 1971, they talked about how to treat and prevent the crisis in the priesthood. Where are we now, right? We still have some crisis in the priesthood. The Vatican is, and the church is helping to address that in many different ways, which is very good. But anyway, they gave this talk, and the bishops left, except for one archbishop. And he came up to them, and he was so intrigued by their conversation and the talk that he spent the afternoon asking them questions about it and listening to them. And that was Karol Wojtyła. Later on, John Paul II. And interestingly enough, years later, a few years ago, I was talking to, there are many speakers on the theology of the body, and I said, I told her this story, and she said, it's really interesting because in the theology of the body, John Paul II uses the term affirmation of the value of the person. And that comes directly from my father and Dr. Trua's work. So it's very beautiful. It's like the theology of the body and this therapy, this psychology, go hand in hand. So I wanted you to know that. So here is, whoops, you know what? Oops, there goes my phone. Let's see. Well, I had a picture. I'll just give you the background here on the picture that you're not getting to see. And that is that and many of you probably know this history, but in 1940 in May, Germany invaded the Netherlands. And probably about they wanted to take over, but the Dutch resisted. But the problem was that their army was outnumbered 3-1. And so at about, I think it was 5 days later, in order to get them to stop resisting, Germany bombed Rotterdam. And there is maybe it's the next picture, I'm not sure. No, it's not there. But there's a sculpture in the heart of Rotterdam, which is it's a giant man with its heart cut out, and he's just sort of like holding back the raining bombs. But anyway, about 800 people died and 85,000 people lost their homes. And so, of course, the Dutch, being outnumbered, gave in, and so Germany began to occupy the Netherlands. Now, most of the Dutch resisted the Nazis, and so they did it in various ways. But the interesting thing was the Germans were very smart in how they were going to occupy a country. They would take different groups at different times. They would take physicians, lawyers, businessmen, Jews, Catholics, any group, and they would just attack them individually. And can you imagine what the thought was? Is that, oh, they're just working on the businessmen. Oh, well, we're not physicians, so we're okay. So if they hadn't done anything to your group, you thought you were safe. But if they had attacked everybody and oppressed everybody at the same time, everyone would have resisted at the same time, right? So people weren't really thinking in terms of what are they doing. Now, this was also true for the confiscation of personal belongings. The Nazis began to take radios, gold coins, bicycles, cars, dogs. If the German had taken them all at once, there would have been a big revolt. So this was the beginning of the resistance. Let me just see. I must have given Michael a different PowerPoint. So what I'll tell you is my father was in medical school in Amsterdam at the time that the Germans were occupying the Netherlands. And in 1942, the Gestapo, and this is like maybe 2.5 years after they came into the country, they began to tell the Jewish professors in all the schools of higher education that they couldn't teach anymore. So the students in the medical school, and probably in the law schools and whatever else, they revolted. And they decided, they said, this was over Christmas vacation, I guess, they decided we're not going to go back. And so the Gestapo said, if you do not go back to school, there will be reprisals. So they were going to start killing people. They were going to start killing some of the professors. So they came back. So about 2 to 3 weeks later, I have to say, this is probably the only time I would ever say this, but it was lucky my dad smoked, because they had a smoke break during their schooling. And so they were all out they had gone back to school, and they were in between classes on a smoke break, and all of a sudden, some of the students were running down the hall saying, the Gestapo, the Gestapo. And so there's this big panic that everybody and all the students in the school were going to be taken. What the Gestapo was doing was they were going to take all these students back to Germany and put them in their labor camps, because they finally realized, why should we use our own young people to build the factories and ammunition when we could use slave labor? So what happened is everybody is crowding out the doors. My dad was one of 6 students that he just ran, and he ran all the way down into the basement, and he providentially, not by chance, I'm sure, went into this room marked biohazard. And so the Gestapo looked through the whole school, and they never went in there, probably because it was marked that way. So they stayed there for about 2 or 3 hours. Finally, the janitor came, and he said, they're gone, everybody's gone. And so they left. And he did see, my dad said in the book, he did see that there were some students that actually belonged, I can't remember what it was called, but something to do with had more of allegiance to the Nazis and looking at him. And so they sort of spied them. So the Gestapo knew that my father and his friends had not been caught, and so they were on the lookout for them. But then they, even as young students, my father must have been, I'd say maybe 22, 23. And so they went into the resistance, the Dutch resistance, and I think I don't think he describes a whole lot of what they did in the Netherlands, but they tried to undermine the Nazi occupation in little ways and in big ways, and they did what they could. Then they began to realize that the Nazis knew who they were, what they were doing, where they were, and so they were going to come after them and capture them. So they fled into France, and they had contacts in France, in Paris, and they had to go into the French underground. And you've got this here. And when they were in Holland, I'll back up a second, Every night they had to stay at somebody else's house because the Nazis could figure out easily if they were staying there, they could find them. So they went into the French underground. They had to go to Paris. They had to get new identities. So one of the interesting things, and of course, we're reading this when we're teenagers and young adults. This is, 20 years later after the war, or actually 30 years later. And my father and his friends they went into this man's, they found out the contact, and it's sort of like some of these movies that you see where they're going in to get, forged identities. And so he tells the story how they went to this one building and somebody's at the door, and so he rings a bell, and then there's another bell so they can go up in the elevator to this one floor, and they go in and they're getting ready to tell them, we need forged identities. And this man says to them, you do whatever I tell you, and when there's probably gonna be a bell, because that'll mean that the Gestapo is on their way up the stairs, and you're gonna follow me exactly and do exactly what I do. So they're working on the forged identities, and all of a sudden there's a bell, so they're being warned. And so this man says, follow me, and he goes up this ladder to the top of the building. They're on the roof of the building, and my father details that they walk across the building, and of course in France, I think buildings are pretty close together, and they jump to the next building, they go down the ladder into another room, and they're playing cards. And they say, you are Monsieur so-and-so, and you are Monsieur so-and-so. And so they're playing cards until another bell rings, and they could go up and go over back down to that building and finish the forged identities. So as I say this, because as teenagers reading this for the first time, we're sort of like, how you look at you don't know your dad like this. And so we're like reading it, and it's like, look at your father, it's like, Dad? It was like James Bond, but he wasn't like James Bond. But then they spent about six months in France, and what they did was they went over to Cherbourg, which is on the coast of France near England, and they were involved in helping the Allied flyers who had been shot down in France get back to England. So once again, they did that for about 6 months. They were very successful. And so then they heard that the Gestapo was getting ready to come and get them. They knew what they were doing, who they were. And so there were a lot of people, they decided they had to move on. And a lot of people here, now this isn't a picture of my father or anything, I just got these off the internet, but it sort of shows you a lot of people would take various routes from France, and they would walk across the Pyrenees Mountains into Spain, which was neutral. And that's how they escaped the Nazis. So that was their plan. So they arrived in Lourdes. I'm sure some of you have been to the Shrine of Lourdes. So they went to the town, and I'm sure my father, made some prayers there. And so it was October, so it was already getting rainy and very cold, and so they were actually delayed because another group had to leave before them, and there weren't very many guides. And someone said to them, they were going to have 2 guides, and someone said to them, if you don't do anything else, don't let your guides leave once you are in the mountains. And so they're like, okay, that definitely, we don't want that. So there were about 30, in their group, they got 2 French guides. There was a group of 34 refugees. They included Americans, English, French, Polish, Dutch, and Tunisians. And they had the one of the Frenchmen in front and one in the back. And they left Lourdes at night in the rain. And you can imagine in the mountains, they can't have lights at all. I mean, maybe the guides had a little bit of light. There was so much heavy rain that he said no one could see in front of them at all. They walked with their arms out, and they must have been just touching the person in front of them. He said no one of those 34 people was dressed for the weather. There was one woman who had a light summer coat and very thin stockings. There were 3 Polish flyers who had spent 4 years in a German POW camp. They had escaped. They didn't even have coats. So the group was walking. They had to keep walking for 39 hours altogether with only 2.5 hours rest. And they fell into ditches, scrambled over barbed wire, they tore their clothes, they waded through streams, they fell over huge stones, but they had to go up. They went up to 10,000 feet in the mountains in order to avoid the German patrol. But this route had never been used in winter, and there was at least one man who froze to death. You know, when you get that tired, I think, and cold, all you want to do is lie down. And apparently that's what happened to some of these people. So my father, he tells the story, he realized by watching the guides that they were actually lost themselves. And they were so exhausted that they would sort of look at each other uncertainly, and then they go off in some different direction. And so the guides finally left them, and they said, we have to go back, because if we keep going and there's snow, we can't get back to Lourdes. We can't get back to France. So all you have to do, listen, famous last words, all you have to do is walk over that mountain and you'll be in Spain. So my father and everybody else in the group was so exhausted that they didn't protest because they didn't have any energy left. So they set out and they got totally lost. And it was finally at the end of October, he said it was October 29th, 1943, they were finally found by the German patrol with their dogs. And my dad said in the book, that was the only time during the war that he was actually glad to see the Nazis, because otherwise they would have died in there. So they are imprisoned, and this is the Saint-Michel prison in Toulouse, which is in southern France, and they were interrogated by the Gestapo. As I recall in the book, it was sort of an interesting way. On the way there, I think he had 2 friends, and they just created a story, and they all were going to stick with the story, and so they were able to keep that. The 3 of them have this story be all the same for the 3 of them. But then they began having their daily ration of food was a lump of bread and some warm water with a few cabbage leaves in the evening. So they're already getting weaker. And then they heard, he wasn't in the same cell with his friends. They would communicate by yelling, probably when the guards weren't around. And so they began to hear stories that there were 3 expert torturers in that prison. And so they began praying that they would not meet up with these torturers, which luckily they did not. I don't know why they didn't approach them. So then they were transported to a concentration camp north of Paris, in I think it's the town of Compiègne. And then there were French priest prisoners there who were allowed to say Mass. So this began to give them a little bit of hope. It was a great consolation to them. One of the things that happened to them is that they had lice. They said they never were able to get rid of the lice. And they said that camp was not too bad, except for the roll calls morning and evening, where the inmates would, and I think you've probably seen this in World War II movies, where the inmates have to stand outside in the cold. They don't have coats. They just have their prison garb. And maybe for hours while the guards are calling out the names of all the prisoners to make sure they're still there. So they were beginning to see, what it was like. And they feared that what was going to happen, they had heard of Buchenwald. Buchenwald was actually the first concentration camp that was created in Germany by the Nazis in the 30s. And they feared being transported into Germany because they knew that if they got into Germany, into Germany, they would not be able to escape at all because there wouldn't be anyone to help them. And they wouldn't have any religious rights at all. But they were there from the end of October, I think, until it was probably about 6 weeks. And they hadn't been sent or designated to go to Germany, so they began to be hopeful. And then unfortunately, and this is just from the internet, so it's nothing to do with my dad specifically, but in December 12th of 43, my father's name was called to be transported to Germany, and there were 1,000 prisoners that were going to be going there. So what they were searched in preparation for this trip, and they weren't supposed to have anything, but several of them were able to smuggle knives and some kind of scissors or something with them. I don't know how they did it, but Germans didn't have TSA, I guess. But they were able to do that, and then my father said at one point, the guard that was searching him found his French prayer book. And so he took it from him and hit him over the head, and he said something like, God, you will not need in Germany, anymore. And my father said he thought that the Germans thought that they could sort of wipe out their religious beliefs in that way by intimidation and getting rid of things, but it made him stronger to persevere in his faith as a Catholic. And then this is the inside of a boxcar, again from the internet. So they had like 2 little windows like this. And so they were herded into boxcars with 100 people in theirs. Now, the boxcar apparently had seats, but it would only seat 80 people. So they all had to stand. And they were in this boxcar for 2 days and 2 nights. And so my father and his friends, his 2 friends, were able to remove the windows in the boxcars so they could at least get a little bit of air, because there was no air circulation at all. And then as they moved along, in the boxcar, they were moving, and they decided to make a plan. And they were gonna, Jimmy opened the door, and then before they were taken into Germany, they were all gonna jump out in France and make a run for it. And just as they were opening the door, apparently the boxcar in front of them had the same plan, and they jumped, and they were all shot to death. And so they closed the door, and they kept on going. So it was like that was their last hope, that they saw, that they abandoned the plan. Now, here's another picture. In the boxcar, they were only given bread and sausage, but no water. What does sausage have in it? Salt, right? So it makes you very thirsty. So my dad detailed how after a while people were so thirsty that they began to lose their senses, and they would start fights. Some of them actually sort of went crazy. It was pandemonium in the boxcars. It's something, I don't think I have ever read in some of the other accounts that, how terrible it was just in the boxcar, because people really didn't have anything to drink. And then as they went along through France, they were headed north, they were headed into Germany, and he knew it was a possibility that he would end up in Buchenwald, and they had heard about it. He feared this, but he felt like he too was beginning to lose control. And they finally ended up at Buchenwald. The doors were thrown open. There was a gang of SS that had whips, guns, and sticks, and they also had bloodhounds. And apparently they had taken all the shoes of the people in the boxcars. So they're of course, this is in October, or no, this is in December by that time, so it's got to be really cold. So they herd them out of there, and then they, put them in there. But this is what he said. This is a quote from the book. After 2 days and 2 nights in an overcrowded cattle car where men had almost become beasts in their struggle for survival, we were driven barefooted in the snow past the crematorium, where already the cadavers of our own transport were being stacked. Our first intimate acquaintance with one of the most notorious products of the Nazi culture was on that 16th day of December 1943 at 4 in the morning. So this is the front gate to Buchenwald concentration camp. And there were many different kinds of prisoners that were sent there. Some were criminals, some were German communists, and of course the communists and the Nazis didn't really like each other. There were gypsies, Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, and political prisoners. And I think my father probably fell into the political prisoners. And there were also people that were labeled asocial. And that meant that, and it didn't really explain what this meant. I'd have to look it up somewhere, but they were called asocial because they just wouldn't work. And I'm thinking maybe some of them were disabled and they couldn't work. But they got to go to prison. They got to go to a concentration camp. And one of the things I will say that my father also said, he said, the Jews, of course, we know there were 6 million of them who died in the Holocaust. But there were 9 million non-Jews who were killed in the Holocaust. So there were 15 million people that died under Nazi domination. So we hear about the Jews, but it is important to know that anyone who opposed the Nazis was their enemy and they were going to exterminate them. And of course we know about, now these two were not in Buchenwald, but Father Maximilian Kolbe, of course, I think Dachau, and Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, and I can't remember if she was in Auschwitz. I think she was in Auschwitz. So and many priests and religious were persecuted by being put in the camps. So I don't know if I'm saying this in German right, but it's Jedem das Sein. And that means, it's the motto of Buchenwald, so it was on the gate. And it means to each his own, or maybe more aptly said, to each what he deserves. And this may refer to how the Germans thought of themselves as the master race, and that they probably could do anything. They could degrade people, they could destroy others in order to preserve the Aryan race. So this was a very cynical, dehumanizing slogan that the prisoners just deserved their fate. Now, some of the pictures here, there's just mainly pictures of, they may be somewhat disturbing, but it's simply people who have been because of malnutrition, they're sort of emaciated. But this one is, this is in the emergency hospital in Buchenwald. And this is a Czech doctor leaning over a pitifully thin patient on a stretcher. He's had an operation, and his hips stand out. You can see from his emaciated body. I don't know how he could possibly have survived, but this man was a Hungarian Jew. And I'll tell you a little bit, too, about when my father got into, in some of the movies you see, they get off the boxcars, and there's like little tables, and they go to the little tables, and then somebody at that table asks them questions, and then tells them where they're going to be in the camp. Well, that happened with my father, and he happened to go to a table where there was a Dutch law professor who was, he was imprisoned there, and he said, well, what do you do? And my father said, I'm a medical student. And he said, don't tell them you're a medical student. And my father said, well, I can't say that. I'm not. I haven't passed my boards. And the professor said, if you tell them you're a medical student, they will send you out into they have a factory where they're working on this thing called the V-bomb. And the conditions are so terrible there that you will be dead in 6 weeks. So tell them you're a doctor. And so my father agreed. And so he was, luckily, because of that interaction, he was sent to work in the infirmary. And that probably saved his life, even though he had a little bit better rations than some of the other prisoners, but it was still pretty terrible, and I'm going to tell you more about it. There was this subculture, just like we hear in the prisons, in all prisons, there's sort of a subculture among the prisoners. And the doctors, I say that in quotes, that my father worked with were often criminals or ordinary people. There were bakers and there were bicycle repairmen who were acting as doctors, who learned to perform surgeries that were necessary, and they became very adept at this. Now, it's amazing to think of that, but they were able to do that. So that's probably what's sort of happening in this picture. So he was put to work in this, he was actually worked sort of as a nurse underneath some of these things. One of the particular doctors that was his superior had been appointed by the SS. He was a German criminal who had been condemned to Buchenwald for murder. And he was the doctor over my dad. And this man only gave medicine to patients because he was supposed to. Let's see, I'm not sure what the picture is here, this one. One of the things, I want to tell you a nice story here in the midst of all this. One other person who really inspired my father's and deepened my father's religious fervor was a French priest called Father George, and he could be seen walking with prisoners in the evening where he would hear their confession. And I'm sure we can sort of think about Maximilian Kolbe and these other priests that were in the camps who probably did the same thing. And Easter 1944 was the first time my father was able to receive Holy Communion. And after that, he was able to receive daily, and Father George gave him regularly one or more consecrated hosts that he was able to carry with him every day. And my father said in the book, he said of the sacred host, it was God's continuous presence and his grace that carried me unharmed through all the dangers of the long hours of my captivity. He was able to carry Holy Communion to a few of his patients, but he obviously had to be very careful not to be observed. And then, unfortunately, one day, Father George and all the Catholic priests were transferred to Dachau. And my father said of this priest, he had taught us how to live. It was very beautiful. Now this, I'm going to show you a picture also of some emaciated prisoners. And this is actually from after. I'm going to talk more about what happened in Buchenwald, but this is a picture taken after they were liberated. So these men you can see are very emaciated. And this is Barrack 56. And have you ever heard of, he was a Jewish author, Elie Wiesel? Some of you read his book, Night. He is, I don't have my little pointer, but in the second, let me see if I can point to this. He is right here. So he was also in the camp. I don't know if my father knew him at all, but he later on, I think he won the Nobel Prize for something, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that, like the Jewish thought about it, about the camps and the Nazis. And here we have, again, this is after they were liberated. You can see how emaciated these men are. They hardly had any food. But in the camp, again, the prisoners ran the camp. The criminals and the communists. The communists murdered most of the criminals before my father arrived, and the SS allowed the communists to run the camp because they had the same goal. They wanted to murder anybody who was against them. So they were the main characters of a story of treachery by prisoners. And here is jewelry confiscated from prisoners. the commander, his name was Karl, I don't know how you say it in German, but Karl Koch. He was called the Butcher of Buchenwald. He stole from the inmates, I can't remember, like $5 million worth of jewelry and valuables. He became wealthy. He had an artist prisoner do portraits of his family. He had the inmates build a beautiful house for him. He had furniture manufactured by slave labor. And eventually, he got his just desserts because the SS actually murdered him because they were jealous of him. His wife was known as, I won't say the word, but you can imagine what the word was, of Buchenwald. And she would actually, well, I won't say it here. You can ask me later, because it's not a nice thing to tell about a person. Now, this is in late August 1944. This is an aerial view of Buchenwald. The Allies actually bombed Buchenwald, and not one of the barracks where the inmates lived was touched. Although the factories, the houses, and the garages of the SS were destroyed. And you can imagine the effect that had on the prisoners, because then they knew that the Allies knew they were there, and they knew exactly what was going on in Buchenwald. So none of the inmates got hurt at all. They knew all about Buchenwald. Now this is just another, obviously you can see these are American soldiers looking at what's happened there. But the camp kept doubling in numbers as the German emptied their other labor camps into Buchenwald by forced marches. And oftentimes, and you've heard these stories too, when the inmates, the prisoners, were on these marches, if they couldn't go any further, well, they were just shot. And then, of course, when they got to Buchenwald, then the rations had to be cut in half. And so they had even less to eat. And so a lot of them really suffered from malnutrition. And then really the emaciated prisoners would probably fight over food and killed each other for just a small ration of bread. But they had, as you've seen in some of the TV shows and movies, they had ways to listen on radio, even to the German broadcasts. And they knew, because the Germans were saying, this is in 1944, and of course the war ended in 45, they realized, because the Germans were crowing about all their victories against the Allies, that the Germans were lying, and actually the Allies were marching across Europe towards them. And so they were very hopeful. This gave them a lot of hope. And they could hear constant bombing daily until they were liberated in 45. And here's just another picture here. Early in 45, the Germans started slowly exterminating the prisoners to sort of get rid of the evidence, right? Well, how do you get rid of that much evidence? And one of I think it was the same person I was talking to you about, the superior to my father in the infirmary, the doctor, quote unquote, used his position there to murder his enemies in the shower by injecting them with arsenic. And so another communist who worked in another ward asked my father to inject patients with poison because they wouldn't be expected to live anyway. And naturally, he refused to do that. But they liberated, they finally realized, as they could hear on the radios with the news, they knew that the Allies were getting closer, and they realized that it was the Americans and not the Russians that were going to liberate them. But then the commander of Buchenwald also knew that, and so he was determined to exterminate as many people as possible. So he would march, I think first the Jews out of Buchenwald, and then murder them in the forests. Let's see. They were going to kill everybody in the camp. And this is a picture on the left. that is General Patton, and then the next 4-star general is Omar Bradley, and then you could see Eisenhower. And this is Patton's 5th Army entered Buchenwald the afternoon of Wednesday, April 11th, 1945. And at that time, I don't have a number for how many people had actually been in Buchenwald, but I'm thinking it was probably several 100,000 at least, if not more than that. But only 21,000 inmates remained. And every year of his life, on April 11th, we would have a celebration. My dad always wanted to celebrate his Liberation Day because it was so important. And one of the things that he attributed to his survival against the Nazis in this terrible place was that he remained angry at them for depriving him of his freedom. So that's going to sort of tie in with that last talk I'm going to give you, that his anger helped him. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but a lot of people, even though they weren't maybe physically at the point of dying, but in the camps they lost hope, and they actually died of hopelessness. So hope is a very important emotion and virtue. And so that was one of the things that I wanted to mention to you. And this is after the liberation of the camps. The Buchenwald is outside the small town of Weimar in Germany. And so at the bottom, you have all these people, I think it was Patton, who made the people of Weimar, the communists who lived there, go into Buchenwald to see what the Nazis had done. And you can't really see it, but I think you can imagine what is in this cart. They said there were, I think, just corpses stacked like wood in Buchenwald. And this was the first picture of Buchenwald to come out in April of 45. And this is just, it's sort of blurry, but these are some of the women coming from, with her, she's got her furs there, and they're walked through to see all the things that the Nazis did, that they had supported. And here again is just more of the same. Sort of having to be confronted with what they had not done anything about. And this picture, I think you see it, this is a survivor standing adjacent to a pile of human bones. So he's just looking at that. This is near the crematorium. These are 4 adolescent inmates in front of one of the stone barracks. And this is a former inmate after liberation, a Russian who was too weak to stand up. And after liberation, there were almost 5,000 persons in need of medical care in Buchenwald. And it's sort of surprising there weren't more. And these are just a little bit, these are some of the former prisoners talking to American soldiers. And here, of course, are the ovens. That we had this industrialized mass murder. And this is a quote from, I don't know who this was, a French priest who survived Buchenwald. When one speaks of the privilege of coming out alive from Buchenwald, one must also consider the fact that it has been an even greater privilege to have been sent there. And even this, without the first, is a privilege indeed. And I'm going to read you, that is an amazing statement, isn't it? I'm going to read you my father's, this is at the end of his book. And my father came from a wealthy family in the Netherlands. And I think, he would never have said this, but I think because he was privileged, he probably took a lot of things for granted, like we all do. But this is what he said. He said, "Yes, it has been a privilege, even though in the beginning I rebelled against God's holy will and in my conceit demanded an answer as to why it had to be me and not my neighbor who had to undergo such misery. But as time passed, my eyes were opened and I began to see what before I could not comprehend. I had come to understand the real value of the things I had once thought important and worth living for. When life was sweet and carefree, I had valued money, for example, because I thought it could buy me happiness. It could not, however, buy me freedom. The best of foods and wines and all the delicacies that please the tongue had also once seemed important, yet bread and water sufficed to keep body and soul together. I valued a carefree life, reaping the fruits of my education. However, the miseries of prison life had taught me the real meaning of life. I had not valued God and his commands, but now in prison, I realized that I could not live without him, that life without God has no meaning. So that is what I wanted to present to you. As I told you, in 1946, he stayed probably a few months after liberation and acted as a translator. My father spoke 5 languages, as most Europeans do. And so he translated for them, and then when that was done, he went back to his family in Holland. And then he'd always wanted to be an American citizen, so that is after January 1st of 46, he came to the United States, and then later on completed his residency, became a physician, married my mom, and the rest is sort of history. Anyway, I think I'll stop there and just ask if you have any questions or comments or can relate to any of this in any way, or maybe some of you have relatives that went through the camps. Or just comments. Well, I mean, my father was a quiet man. I think like a lot of men who went through the war, even though he wrote this, he never wanted to talk about it. And because I think it was too horrible. And I think, I mean, it made him, I think I saw him grow in, I think he led a saintly life. Now, I wouldn't have thought that as a young person, because I wasn't interested in that. And if he was being saintly, it was against what I wanted, right? But his work really impacted me. I got a degree from University of Dallas in philosophy, not that great of a student in philosophy, but it really wasn't what I wanted to do. I really just enjoyed, learning about it. And so I thought I really need to discern what God is calling me to. And so I prayed the rosary for about 1.5 years, and I read my father's books real thoroughly. And they were so beautiful, not just this book, but his professional books. They're so beautiful that's what moved my heart, and I really knew without a doubt that is where God was calling me. So it's really blessed me so much to be a therapist now for 40 years. And just what I want to do is share it with other people and help other therapists to see what the beauty of it is and how it can help people. So, yeah. Yes? Yes, none of them, yes, they all survived. None of them went to the camps. And I think we think it was because I had 2 uncles and then I had 3 aunts. And the 2 uncles, I think they hid. They had a big house in Rotterdam, and I have never been in it. It doesn't exist anymore. But I understood that there were secret places to hide, and I think they hid the boys. One of them was a lot younger than my father. If my father was early 20s, he was probably 15. But they would have been in danger of being taken to Germany, to the camps. So I think they hid. But there was also the last winter of the war, the Germans had taken all the food and animals, and they called it the hunger winter. And the Dutch had to eat tulip bulbs to survive. And years and years later, we went with my aunt and uncle. My uncle was my uncle by marriage. And we went to visit them, and then we went down to Normandy, and this was in 1984. And so it was when Reagan was over there, and I think he made his big speech. But anyway, we went to Normandy, and we went through the bunkers, and it was just fascinating. And all of a sudden, we realized, where's my uncle? And so we go out, we go through the tour, and we go out, and he is fuming. And we're like, what's wrong? And he said, I was standing next to a man that was speaking German, and I couldn't stand it. And that's 40 years later. But then he talked about the hunger winter. He said, we were starving the whole winter, and it was because of them. So that generation really hung on to that. I think maybe not everyone, but a lot of them did, because it was devastating. So, yeah. Yes, thank you. Okay, so the question is, a lot of people, when they go through that kind of suffering, turn away from God. And how did this actually turn my dad towards God? I think it was one of these things. I had a professor in college who used to say to us, suffering brings wisdom. And I never forgot that phrase. And as I have gone through my life, I've always, whenever I think of it, I think, that is so true. Like, unless you don't let the suffering bring you something to a different place, right? That you remain bitter. And actually, what I wanted to show you, and I just don't have it available here, is some of the quotes by Elie Wiesel. And one of his quotes was, and I'm not saying this is a Jewish attitude, but it was his. He said, like, a Jew, having gone through this, has to remain, like, just angry your whole life, otherwise you're sort of capitulating to this terrible thing that happened. But it's a different mindset. Maybe it kept him going, but it wasn't something, I don't know what it did to him religiously, but it was a different way of thinking. Well, with my father, he came from a Catholic family. A lot of people say, well, how is that? Because a lot of the Dutch are like Dutch Reformed, they're not Catholic. And he was lucky enough to be raised as a Catholic. But my impression was that he was somewhat spoiled when he was growing up because they had a lot of money. And like he said that, he had, we have pictures of him at these really fancy dinners, I think at their house, and he's wearing a tux and a white tie, and it's sort of cool looking, but I'm thinking, this was his life. And I think that he must have had enough faith, like these sparks of faith, it was fanned when somebody was going to take it away from him. And I think probably being with this priest, this Father George, the French priest, and how Father George would obviously say Mass and confect the Eucharist and allow him to take it, I think that must have meant a lot to him. And I think because he didn't have anything else, I think that's where he began focused more on God above all things. That, like I just read you this, life without God doesn't have any meaning. And he could see it, like this is what comes of it with what the Nazis did. That it's a terrible meaning. It's so self-centered. It's violent. And so that's my thought. And I think after that, especially after he met his colleague, which was probably about in 1957, when he went into the field of psychiatry, in that time it was mainly Freud, I think, Freudian thinking, and he felt like he couldn't really help anybody with that. He was getting very disillusioned. I'll tell you this little story. He got very disillusioned, and so he told my mom, he said, well, I think I'm going to move to a different specialty because I feel like I can't help anybody as a psychiatrist. And so he said, I'm going to give it one more shot. There's this big name, I don't know who it was, going to give a conference in Switzerland, and so I'm going to go over there, and I'm going to let that speak to me, and God's going to have to show me that either I stay in psychiatry or I'm going to go into this other field, whatever it was. So he goes all the way to Switzerland, sits down in the conference, and the guy doesn't show up. And so he takes it as a sign from God that he doesn't need to be a psychiatrist anymore, he can leave. So he had a cousin who was a Benedictine monk in Belgium. So he goes to visit his cousin, and he tells him all this, and he says, this is my plan. And his cousin gives him a book, and he says, well, before you make any decision, I think you need to read this book of this woman psychiatrist. And it was in Dutch, and who can read Dutch but a Dutchman, And so it was her dissertation on St. Thomas Aquinas. So he takes it home, he visited his family, takes it home, tells my mom what had happened. And when he opened the book and he read it, my mom told the story that he came out of his office one day and he said, this is it. This is the truth. And so that's when he contacted her and became her student. And it was like it opened his eyes, like it's possible to really help people with severe obsessive compulsive disorder, people who have been very neglected in childhood. And so he wanted to integrate that. It changed his entire life. But it was so providential, right? Because it was like that was going to be God's sign. And then he visits the cousin, and the cousin gives him the book and changes his life. So I don't know much more else to say about that, but I think that's probably where it comes. Basically, being deprived of your freedom means you're not going to deprive me of my freedom. I think that was his thought, Anybody else? Yes? I think it was one of these things where and I'll talk about this, not about my dad so much on Tuesday night. I think it's one of these things where you can't hold on to it and keep going in life, because bitterness, it binds you. It binds you to the person that you're angry at or the persons you're angry at. And so you cannot move forward. And I think he knew that. He didn't like them. I don't think he would ever say he liked any of them, or wanted to be around them. That's really doesn't have anything to do with forgiveness. But I think he had to let go because he had to move on in life, and there were better things to do. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
At what age were you when you found out your dad had been in prison in Nepal? How old were you, and how did that come out when you found that out? You said your dad didn't talk about it a lot, but
Mm-hmm.
how did that affect you?
The question is, how old was I when I found out my dad had been in Buchenwald, and how did it affect me? I think we were probably teenagers, but it was sort of like, what I was saying is like, we would sort of look at, like we're reading about James Bond here, and it's like you look up and you look at your dad, and he's just your dad, It's like you can't really put those things together. So I don't think it was until later, like early in life, like in my adult life, that we would sort of look at it as, this is really a profound story, And I think later, as I grew in my faith, that meant more even, yeah. So I think as a teenager, you don't really get the whole picture, yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been delightful speaking with you, and I don't know what time it is, so I think it's time to stop. Maybe that's the time it is. Thank you.
I was thinking earlier today in the gospel of Christ's trials in the desert as the preparation for his public ministry of healing, exorcism, and I'm really grateful for you setting things up for us to explore how we can grow in resilience in the negativities of this world, and also deepen our understanding of anger and forgiveness.
Yeah, I think so.
And not as an abstraction, but as a personal way
Yeah,
It's
that's
amazing
right.
that you're bearing witness to
Yeah,
what's in our lifetime.
yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Thank
yeah.
you.
Thank you, Father, for having me here. Thank you all. We'll see you tomorrow night. Thank you.